Good morning, everyone. I'm Rohini Pandey. I'm a professor of economics at Yale and director of the Economic Growth Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this concluding event of our three-day celebration of the 65th anniversary of the Masters in International Development Program. And it's also part of the 60th year celebration of the Economic Growth Center. So when I started as the director of the Growth Center last year, I spent some time just going over the archives of the Economic Growth Center and the IDE program. And I think what was striking to me was just what a fertile period the 1960s was. I think more generally for development economics, but especially at the Growth Center. You know, this 1960s marked the end of colonialism in most parts of the world. And there were a lot of open questions about, both how should low-income countries set their course for the future, but also importantly, what were the roles and responsibilities of academics and policymakers in richer countries. And these discussions were really mirrored in the Economic Growth Center and the researchers who came through in the student discussions. One of the first markers, or one of the first activities of the Economic Growth Center was the Country Studies program, which sent faculty members like Alejandro Carlos Diaz to Latin America, and they formed strong networks in those countries, which continued after they came back. And I think as we look at the Growth Center, past, present, and future, I think it's these links with researchers across the globe. That is one of the things that at least I believe EGC should be very proud of. Latin America was, I think, central to this. In the 1960s, there was a lot of engagement between what was happening in Latin America with discussions of economic development more broadly and with the Growth Center. And so we're delighted to welcome Edmar Bacha and Ana Cecilia Fieler, who will lead a discussion on the Brazilian economy. So let me start by introducing both our panelists. So Ana Cecilia Fieler is a visiting assistant professor at the Economic Growth Center and the Yale Economics Department. She earned her PhD from New York University and has worked at Princeton University and the University of Pennsylvania. In her research, she combines data and models to study the effect of international trade on labor markets and technology adoption in developing countries. We are particularly delighted to welcome her because she will be joining the IDE program and teaching macroeconomics in the fall. Professor Edmar Bacha graduated from the Yale IDE program in 1965, and he was the first student from his original training program in Brazil to be accepted in a doctoral program after a single year of postgraduate coursework. He continued on to at Yale Economics and received his PhD in 1968. He has taught in several universities, both in the United States and Brazil. He's held positions as an economist in policy-making organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank. And he's particularly well known for being part of a group of economists who came up with a plan based on virtual currency that succeeded in slowing down Brazil's rampant inflation in the 1990s. So we're delighted that Professor Basha has joined us today, and I will hand it over to him now. He will give a presentation for around 20 to 25 minutes, followed by a discussion of first the presentation, and then a Q&A with Professor Basha by Cecilia Fieler. And then after that, we'll open for Q&A. We're delighted by the audience that's joined us. We also realize that we may not be able to get to all Q&As, but Professor Basha has kindly agreed that if, as you write your questions, you could also provide your email address, then he would be very happy to respond to them by email later. So Professor Basha, thank you again for joining us, and over to you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back to Hill House Avenue after so many years. Even if it is only virtual. I'm only sorry that after this, we cannot go all together either to Pepe's or Sally's for a beer and a pizza. But anyways, maybe next week we'll do that. My presentation today, it's based on a paper that we published in 5 years ago. It's a joint paper with my dear late friend, Regis Bonelli. And it was used to call, as I read it here, accounting for the rise and fall of Brazil's growth after World War II. But given that Brazil has not improved, actually has gotten worse, since we finished the paper, I decided to change the title to something more dramatic, which is what's gone wrong with Brazil's economy. And my presentation is a story in 4 acts. I first am going to show you in one slide how far behind the US Brazil has stayed over time, so giving you a historical perspective. Then I'll focus more in detail in the growth collapse of Brazil after 1980, formulate a hypothesis that we had in this paper that I mentioned for this collapse, and provide some arguments for this hypothesis, and then shift over to Ana Cecilia to see what else she has to add. We start with this comparison with the US. In this slide, we see the ratio of Brazil's to US per capita income all the way back from 1820 to 2020. I divided these periods here into 6 politically important periods for Brazil. After we became independent of Portugal in 1822, we had a constitutional monarchy, which lasted for most of the 19th century. Then we decided to imitate the United States and became presidentialist with the First Republic. We had the famous dictator Getúlio Vargas coming in for 15 years. And then after he was dismissed, after the end of the Second World War, we had this Second Republic. The militaries took over again in 1964 from a follower of Vargas that was president at the time. They stayed on for 25 years. And since 1985, we're having a democracy, even though with all these difficulties that we're having now with the current president. But anyways, in terms of this per capita income comparisons of the US, you can see that, as Brazil became independent, the per capita income in Brazil was something like 60% of the US. Then by the end of the 19th century, this had gone down to 30%. It continued to decline up until the 1920s. Brazil started growing fast, The United States entered the depression in 1930, but afterwards recovered very nicely during the World War, so that at the beginning of the period that I'm going to consider in the following, 1945, Brazil had a per capita income which was only 20% of the US. And then we started a catching up period, very hopeful, so that by 1980, Brazil's per capita income had gone up a little bit above 40% of the US. But then, and this is what I'm going to talk about, things have been going downwards mostly all the time. And today we are only at something like 23%, the per capita income of the US. Looking more specifically at the post-war period, here in the second slide, I show you the Brazil's GDP growth rate from 1950 to 1920. In blue the annual GDP growth rate. In orange, a 10-year moving average. As you can see from the 10-year moving average, all the way, actually this is from 1940, right? Brazil was growing very nicely, over 7%. This was up until close to 1980. There was a deceleration around 75, but things, if you look at the orange line, sorry, there was a very deep contraction of the economy. It continues to contract up until 1990. That was the lost decade. And then, up and down a little bit with the commodity cycles. And now, Brazil has really, after 1914, a tremendous bad period of which I'm not going to talk much about, And over the last 10 years, actually, the Brazil GDP growth rate has been 0. But my point that I'm going to discuss, what happened, Brazil was growing so nicely up until 1980 after the Second World War, catching up to the US. And then apparently all of a sudden, as a function of the debt crisis of the early 80s, Brazil fell and never more recovered. We grew 7.5 and then start growing at 2.5. This is the focus of the analysis that follows. And in order to analyze this, I use a very simple GDP growth scheme. It's a one factor of production growth scheme. GDP depends on the capital stock. In order to have capital stock to grow, we need savings, and that's where the process here starts. We start from savings, and depending on what the capital goods prices are, these savings motivate an increase in the stock of capital goods, and given this increase in the stock of capital goods, depending on the productivity of capital, you get GDP growth. This is basically what I'm going to be showing to you. So there are 3 fundamental variables here to explain GDP growth. One is savings. The other is the price of new capital goods that these savings are buying. And then the productivity of these capital goods in order to generate GDP growth. So there are 3 factors here that explain the evolution of GDP growth. We start with savings. This is the evolution of the saving rates by periods from 1947 to 2000 and 2020, divided in 8 periods from 1947 to 2010 again. And as you can see here, I'm going to focus on total savings. The domestic savings is the orange line. External savings is the blue line. But I focus on the dark line here for the total savings. You see that, in this period up until 1980 was a period of increasing savings. And from 1980s onwards, it's a period of decreasing savings. So you can see, savings was a fact, in this slowing down of growth. But if you take an average, 47 to 80 compared to 80 2020, the difference, in terms of averages, we're looking at these, long historical periods, the difference in average is not very much, it's only 7%, You couldn't explain the drop of GDP growth from 7.5 to 2.5 on the basis of savings alone, It contributed, but it contributed, I was going to argue, only marginally more important for what happened to GDP growth was this factor, which is the capital good prices, the ratio of investment prices to the prices of GDP, which is here we have showing this capital good prices, an index with the price in 2000 equal to 1. And as you can see, I had to adjust, Regis and I had to adjust at this period that have adjusted prices here as a period of hyperinflation. The national accounts went crazy too. So we just forgot about the original price from the national accounts and make an adjustment here. But anyways, it shows quite clearly, which is a very unique phenomenon in Brazil. If you compare it, you don't find this in other countries. A very substantial increase in the price of capital goods throughout this period from the 1950s up until the 80s. And this essentially, showed that, if you compare now the average price of capital goods in the period 1980 to 2019, this is 30%, 30% higher than it was in the period previous to 1980. So that was a very substantial part of the explanation that even though savings did not decline much, the purchasing power of savings over capital goods, that declined very substantially, not because you had less savings, but because the prices of capital goods that the savings were buying increased so substantially. The second phenomenon that explained the growth collapse is capital productivity, shown in this slide from 1950 to 2020. This is GDP divided by the stock of capital. And again, you can see, that throughout this period up until 1980, there was a continuous decline in the capital productivity in Brazil. And the average that we have in the period after 1980 compared to the period previous to 1980 is a decline of 25%. So you see, capital productivity declined 25%. The price of capital goods increased 30%, and savings declined by 7%. And all this put together, is what explains why GDP growth declined from 7.5 to 2.5 when we compare pre to post 1980. That's the fundamental explanation that we elaborate in the paper that I previously mentioned. So my conclusion here, tentative, because I'm going to try to substantiate in the following, is that the collapse in GDP growth since 1980 had more to do with lower capital productivity and higher capital goods prices than to reduce savings. Hypothesis is that these two phenomena are interconnected. They are a consequence of Brazil maintaining its economy closed to international trade. Brazil deepened an inefficient import substitution process instead of promoting exports, as the countries that overcame the so-called middle income trap did, as I will show in the following. The consequences of this process of inefficient import substitution, this deepening of this inefficient import substitution process, the consequences were higher capital good prices and lower capital productivity, i.e. lower GDP growth. And I'm now going to make some comparisons to substantiate this hypothesis. The first comparison that I make is with Brazil compared to South Korea. Here we have the ratio of Brazil's to South Korea's per capita GDP from 1950 to 2020. As you can see, up until 74, Brazil had a higher per capita income than South Korea, but South Korea started catching up, from the early 60s, and then, not only catched up, but overpassed Brazil. And today, Brazil GDP per capita is only 1/3 that of Korea. Why this happened? There are many explanations in the literature. The one that I like best is this one. This graph show the trade ratios, meaning the sum of exports plus imports over GDP of Brazil and South Korea from 1953 to 2019. Brazil is the solid line. South Korea is the dotted line. As you can see, up until the early 60s, both countries were following the same import substitution process, industrialization through import substitution. But from the early 60s, which is exactly the point from which South Korea started taking off, as I showed in the previous slide, South Korea started having a process of export promotion, increasing the participation of trade in GDP. So that starting from something like 7% in the early 60s, South Korea's trade ratio today is something like 110%, while Brazil, which had 5% trade ratio in the early 60s, only grew very, very slowly, and today has a trade ratio exports plus imports over GDP of only 24%. Brazil remained closed while South Korea opened up. It's not only South Korea. Actually, the 12 countries that overcame the middle income trap after World War, all of them did so by integrating into the world economy, as the trade to GDP, the last column in this table, clearly show. Let's focus on the median. The trade to GDP median ratio, the trade to GDP ratio, the median of that for these countries is 77%, compared to Brazil, 24%. These countries are 3 times more open than Brazil is. And look at that, now at the first column, GDP per capita in $1,000. These countries have a per capita income of $43,000 compared to Brazil, 15,000, 3 times higher. Again, this is a very nice coincidence that I like it. It's interesting. These countries, why the way they integrated to the world economy were different. Some exported industry, South Korea, Hong Kong, Israel, Singapore, Taiwan. Some exported services, Spain, Greece, Ireland, Portugal. And some exported natural resources, Norway, Australia, New Zealand. The way they did it depend their comparative advantages, but that was one fundamental characteristic of all this country, is that in order to be now rich compared to the fact that they were middle class previous to the World War, Second World War, the reason is that they participate very substantially in the world economy as shown by this trade to GDP ratios in contrast to Brazil. And why it's so important, and now I'm going to conclude, to participate in the world economy in order to grow, it is because growth is essentially productivity gains. And after you reach middle class, after you have all your population in urban sectors, the only way to have productivity gains is to participate in international trade. Why is that? Because international trade allows you the adoption of state-of-the-art technology, modern capital goods, productive capital goods, cheap capital goods. It allows you the generation of economies of scale because you're not limited to the domestic market. You have all the world at your disposition, and allows you the specialization in lines of production in which the country has a comparative advantage. Finally, and also equally important, it gives you market competition, survival of the fittest, which is a fundamental test for increasing productivity and allowing GDP growth, something that Brazil, unfortunately, did not do. And this is why, basically, I would like to submit to you, we are now in this situation that we cannot find a way out in order to recover a more decent growth rate as we had in the past. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigada, senhor. So I would like to start by thanking Professor Basha for the wonderful presentation and for accepting the invitation from the IDE, and also remind the audience that the chat is close to them, so please post your questions on the Q&A. What I'll do next is...
Ana Cecilia,
yes.
Should I stop sharing? I'm going to use my...
I'm not going to use the screen. So
okay.
In case some of the questions are about your presentation, you may want to bring them back. What I'm going to do is just briefly summarize my research, and that will naturally bring in some questions to Professor Basha. As he highlighted in his presentation, international trade was the linchpin of economic policy in virtually all the countries that grew sustainably after World War II. And my research delves into firm-level data precisely to understand the mechanisms through which international trade affects economic development, especially in developing countries. So when a firm from a developing country engages in international trade, whether through imports of intermediate inputs or exports, with developed countries' trade of a firm, it typically upgrades the quality of its products, technologies, and management practices. Firms in developed countries are generally more advanced, and there are several reasons why they may want their trading partners to also upgrade their quality. For example, the automated production process typically requires precise specification for parts and higher quality materials. Just-in-time inventory management and integrated computer systems require trading partners to be organized and flexible with their deliveries, billings, and even product specifications. After all, adapting to shocks is one of the main advantages of just-in-time. This upgrading of quality among importers and exporters is well documented in the literature. What's less well known is that for the same reasons, the importers and exporters, as they upgrade, they also require their trading partners domestically to upgrade. And these importers and exporters tend to be very large firms. And so even a relatively small amount of international trade may have a large effect on the domestic market. This amplification effect is particularly felt in the labor market because more advanced technologies, be them programmable machineries, modern management practices, they all complement skilled workers. many countries in Africa and the Middle East and Latin America, including Brazil itself, that liberalized international trade in the 1980s and 90s, saw the wages of their college graduates increase by 10 to 20% relative to their less skilled workers. So a very dramatic increase in inequality in just a few years. The demand for skills in manufacturing also went up dramatically in South Korea and other Southeast Asian countries. But what these countries did differently was that they invested very heavily in education. The manufacturing sector grew, adopted better practices, invested, and improved their productivity. And arguably also had large positive effects on the rest of the economy. While Brazil and other Latin American economies, firms also upgraded and became more skill intensive, but they became more skill intensive by shedding their unskilled workers mostly to the informal sector. The manufacturing sector, as Professor Basha has himself documented, decreased in Brazil from 25% of GDP to 15%. And it didn't have the same positive effects in the rest of the economy. Now, the second difference between East Asia and Latin America is that East Asia promoted its exports and engaged in international production chains, while Brazil and other Latin American countries, similarly, they lowered their trade tariffs, but their infrastructure remained decrepit, their ports corrupt, and this makes the cost and timing of the flow of goods into the country high and unpredictable, which makes it very difficult for Brazilian firms to engage in international production chains when you need goods to come in and out of the country in a predictable and less costly way, especially when firms in the rest of the world are trying to maintain lean inventories. So putting this research background together with Professor Basha's work leads to a few questions. So first is that I just suggested that and again, Professor Basha has insisted in his previous work that in order to fully take advantage of international trade and growth prospects, the country needs to invest in infrastructure and education. Professor Basha shows, however, in previous work that the tax burden in Brazil is high for a country of its income level, and most of this tax revenue is absorbed into the pension and payroll system. So Professor Basha, can you tell us a little bit about structural reforms, and in particular, the recent reforms of the pension system? How deep was it? And is the administrative reform politically viable so that resources can be freed up for infrastructure and education?
Ana Cecilia, thank you for a very good compliment. I certainly stimulated to read more of your research and integrate your results into my own work. And your comments, about that are other factors besides opening to trade, in order to explain, I brought some additional slide just in case, which essentially are directed to this process. If I can move here to, yes. That's opening up to international trade is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient, And this, if you can see, if you are a big and unequal country, like Mexico is, same as Brazil, Mexico with NAFTA open up to international trade very nicely, It used to have 20% trade ratios, it now has 70%, while Brazil, used to have 10, it's now at that 24. But nonetheless, the growth experiences of both Mexico and Brazil are very similar, Mexico also was growing fast up until 80 and then sunk, and never saw growth resume anymore, not even with NAFTA helping along. And this means that other factors intervene as far as, when you are both big and unequal, And one of them, as you mentioned, is education or education quality in Brazil, according to the PISA 2015, is very bad, in science. Sorry for being this in Portuguese, but that's the way it is. In science, in reading, in mathematics, Brazil is way down, in terms of the rating that Brazilian students get in this international competition. And it's not so much, the question of education spending, in the horizontal axis here, you have education spending per pupil per year.
I'm sorry, but we can't see your new slides. I don't think
I'm sorry? You cannot see what?
Your slides, we don't see it.
They're not showing?
No,
not any of them?
I don't see them. Maybe someone else in the panel can intervene if they see it.
No, we can't see it.
Sorry?
No, we can't see it.
Oh, anyway, I'm sorry. Then,
you can describe.
They can describe here. But anyway, this is there's a graph that shows education spending per pupil compared to the PISA results, And Brazil, even though it spends, normally for its income level, but the quality of its education, it does not show in the results. Chile spends as much as Brazil, Uruguay, and they have a much better results in PISA than Brazil has. So the education quality, not only spending, is very important. The other factor is the very low quality of infrastructure. This picture that you're not seeing, so the low quality of infrastructure in the BRIC countries. Let me see if I can do something here. Sorry. Is that better? No.
No, maybe if you send an email to Scott with the presentation attached, that he can share it.
Professor Basha, are these on your? What about now? Are these on your additional slides?
Yeah. What about this now?
No, I think you're sharing the wrong screen.
Well, okay. Anyways. So I'm showing that the infrastructure, the Brazil is the worst of the BRICS. And then the next one is just to show Brazil has very high tax rates. We tax Brazilians more than the Japanese tax the Japanese. We tax Brazilians more than the Americans tax, the US tax the Americans. So even though we have a tax rate which is very high, which is concentrated in indirect taxes, not in direct taxes. All of these go into pension spending. Brazil is the country that, relative to this dependency ratio, the ratio of old to young people, is the country that spends more in the world in terms of pensions. We spend something like 15% of GDP on pensions. And we also spend very substantially with public servants. 13% of GDP, only South Africa spends more than us. And when you add up, the expenditures of the government with pensions and with civil servants, they get to near to 80% of the total budget. So there is very little left in terms of let me try to fetch it here. In terms of alternatives for the government to spend in, even improving the quality of education, and also the quantity of education in health, in education, and in infrastructure. So basically, besides having an inefficient private sector, because it's not integrated into the world economy, we have a bloated public sector. So besides, opening up, we also need a very substantial reform, administrative reform, and a reform in our tax system in order to be able, to provide education and infrastructure in order to complement what the gains that we would observe in case Brazil finally decides to open up.
Okay, just a short point on education. I know it's a little bit outside your research, but you correctly mentioned that it's not so much the amount of spending. I think the US has the same issue, but it's the quality. Have you seen any, or are there any types of policy to try to improve the quality that you find particularly persuasive in terms of improving education?
There are lots of experiments in Brazil, especially when a poor state of Ceará, a particular big state of the interior of Ceará, which is called Sobral, which has a behavior in terms of the quality of education that's substantially higher than anywhere else in Brazil, and they didn't do no magic, they just they had a stimulus plan. The state gave back some taxes to the cities and towns that improved their education performance. Money helps. They also looked very careful in terms of the size of classes, the quality of the teachers, and especially, the quality of the directors of the primary schools. So, it can be done. And the problem really is, not so much then, in terms of spending, though, we do need some of that, but it's how would it be possible to emulate and to use these experiences that you have, Espírito Santo, which is another poor state, also had a tremendous improvement in the education system, So it can be done, I think it's fundamentally a question of political will.
Yes. It's very difficult. Let me go back to the question of openness and differences in policy between Latin America and Asia. So you were one of the architects of the Real Plan, as Rohini mentioned, and which successfully ended the Brazilian struggle with inflation, for which my generation is very grateful. And the plan in 1994 came shortly after the 1991 trade liberalization. It involved the tighter monetary policy and resulted in a real exchange rate appreciation. This made it difficult for Brazilian firms to compete with imports and exports and to export their output. Now, if Brazil were to open up more for international trade today, is it viable for it to follow the example of East Asia and maintain its exchange rate devalued without inflation picking up again? What's your take on that?
Yeah, that was a very unfortunate coincidence of experiments, because there was an opening up in 1990, which was going relatively well, with some sectoral and regional difficulties, but overall, it was improving. But then, we had a system which was a fixed exchange rate system in the period, First, it was a parity with the dollar. And then when we made the Real Plan was very successful, but it had to rely, in order to keep inflation down, on an exchange rate anchor. So, and that exchange rate anchor produced an overvaluation of the currency, so that on top of the decline in tariffs, we also had an overvaluation of the currency, which submitted their domestic producers to very strong pressures, and they eventually got together and managed to have the country to reverse the opening up that we had in 1990. So one lesson of this period, don't try to open up and revalue your currency at the same time. Fortunately, now we have a floating exchange rate. So what you would expect in the case of opening up, is that as the financial sector anticipates a flood of imports, and that in the consequence, demand for dollars, the financial sector itself, would anticipate this demand for dollars and would devalue the currency, So that could be, a natural consequence of the workings of a floating exchange rate. But anyways, currently, this is not an issue, because for reasons that I think the international press are propagating quite well, the disgrace that this government is, we have the overvalued currency today, the Brazil, 3 years ago, the real was worth, we need three reais for the dollar, and now we need 5.5 reais for the dollar. So, Brazil has a very, it's impossible now, to allege that the exchange rate is not competitive. It's extremely competitive, and this should provide a very good occasion to opening up.
That's right. I want to go on vacation as soon as COVID gives us a reprieve. Yeah. So it is true, just a short comment on what the point you've just made, that naturally opening up to trade, that coming in from imports tends to put pressure downwards and the exchange rate to devalue. On the other hand, hopefully it fosters investment, which tends to push it up a little bit. But you're right, at the moment, it doesn't seem to be an issue at all. I think we're 10 minutes away, and I see there are quite a few questions in the Q&A. So I'd like to turn to the audience. So I guess I can.
Yes, sorry.
Yes, Scott, I don't know if you've selected.
I was just trying to stop that screen share. We do have quite a few questions coming in. Thank you both for the really engaging lecture and discussion so far. Our first question comes from actually one of our current IDE students, Beatrice Nunez. Professor Basha, we have a more specific question regarding the URV. Why did the real plan use one virtual currency and one physical currency instead of two physical currencies?
Well, the original plan, that's called the Larida plan, as Rudy Dornbusch named it, and it was presented in 1985 in Washington, had this idea of, letting two currencies circulate simultaneously. One is the old currency that is depreciating, the other that was, indexed to the dollar. And then people would shift from the old currency to the new currency. And once this process was sufficiently advanced, inflation would have disappeared. The problem is that to have a simultaneous circulation of two currencies, it's very complicated. It's not even clear that this is constitutional. So we decide that it would complicate it too much. We had a very bad experience in Czechoslovakia in 1944 when they had this two currency system, and they had the highest hyperinflation in the world up until Zimbabwe came up on the way recently. So we decide, rather than we have a pre-currency together with the old currency. It's the pre-currency, the unit of real value, whose value was $1. And then we allowed, first we decreed a forced change of wages into the new currency in order to maintain the same parity that the wage had over time under high inflation. And also we converted some other things like rents and school fees according to the law. But then we allow for a 4-month period for everyone else, to change their contracts into URVs, and after we are satisfied, there are sufficiently people converting into RVs. Actually, one of our colleagues, said that he believed that the plan was a success, that once he was going to the beach, to the Ipanema beach, and he looked at a stand, and saw that the price of one cocoa was $1. So if you want coconut, was $1. Sorry, not $1, one URV. So that even the guy who's selling coconuts in the beach, understand what the URV was, we were ready to do the shift, and that's why we made this, and in this process, we are very successful. Actually, the public broadcasting system has a broadcast that I think is available on YouTube if you want to read. They had a very bad title. I complained to them, but they did not change. It's all for drinking buddies managed to stop the inflation in the country. So anyway, that's basically the reason. The dual currency system is very complicated to do. So we did it half of the suggestion, and I think that was very good.
I mean, personally, I think that's a great title for an article. So I would be honored if I were you. We have another great question from one of our participants, Ravisha Gupta. With COVID-related disruptions in global supply chains, now may be a good time for countries in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa to enter these chains and open up to more trade. What would be some requisite domestic features at the country level for this to happen? And are there any countries doing this right now?
Well, right now, that's a big discussion here, that the people, protectionists, are saying, see, this guy who want to open up, if you are dependent on foreigners there, when we need them most, is where they don't have the things available, like difficulties of getting vaccines. In Brazil, it's not even getting the vaccines, they get the inputs to the vaccines, obviously there's this tremendous protectionism in the US now, that has so many vaccines, it's not using AstraZeneca, there's 30 million sitting down. I don't know where, why don't you give it to other countries, that we'll be very happy in Brazil to use the AstraZenecas that are sitting up in the US, without being used, and also probably become useless, because of the data fabrication. So, the question, but otherwise, what people really see, from with those who are not extreme protectionists, it's how important is international collaboration, how important are these integration in order to produce, these successful vaccines that we have now, Pfizer, it's half Germans, it's half Americans, it has a substantial component of Chinese, and so and this is true. People, I think, that are in labs, the pharmaceutical industry here in Brazil, they very quite clear, they cannot do it alone. They don't want protection. They want to have ways of integrating and support of the government for innovation. Like the warp speed process did. Brazil cannot afford a warp speed, obviously, but obviously this is the way, supporting innovation, that's the way to go ahead.
Professor Fieler, do you have anything to add on this?
No, I fully agree with Professor Basha that the world, especially from the perspective of developing countries, are actually gaining from the development of new vaccines coming in from the US. Yeah, US, England, and other countries that themselves are not vaccines coming from insular countries, but coming in from scientists from all over the world and parts from all over the world. So yes, I don't really have much to add there.
All right, thank you. Well, so we only have time for a couple of more questions, maybe one or two more. I'm just going to ask, we have one just came in from Eduardo Costa. Professor Basha, in your view, what's the possible or potential contribution that the Brazilian Amazon region can make to the economic growth and development of Brazil? There's a Brazilian scientist, Dr. Nobre, who refers to Amazon 4.0 as possible new wave of innovation and productivity based on sustainable use of biodiversity resources in the Amazon to produce marketable products. How do you see Amazon making a contribution in the world in the near future?
Well, first of all, you have to put pressure on the current government, to stop destroying the Amazon. This is the first line of defense. If we're going to have the Amazon, we have to make sure that the destructive policy of this government is stopped in its tracks. We were successful, in one aspect, which is getting rid of the the foreign minister here, which was a crazy man, but also the minister of the Meio Ambiente, the minister of that deals with the Amazon now. It's also a negationist. He does not believe in this in global warming. He wants, and Bolsonaro is obviously a stupid person. He wants to develop the Amazon, or he could destroy it all, in order to have it for development the way that we did in the 19th century. The US did in the 19th century. We did it, for most of the 20th century. He would go ahead, So we have to stop these guys first, And for that, the pressure of the international community is very important. Second, there's this whole question of if you have a reasonable government, suppose we can find our Biden, in 2002, 1 year and a half from now. What should we do about the Amazon? Well, first of all, we have to find a way to get rid of the Zona Franca de Manaus, which is a place in Manaus which produces industrial goods, very expensive. It is a thing that only serves, that you import the components, you fabricate the product, the bicycle, for example, and then you shift it to São Paulo. It's just a way of making it more expensive industrial products that we could have more easily without this intermediation. But then you have to put something instead there, right? And people in the Amazon say, well, if people don't fabricate these goods, they're going to destroy the forests. So we have to find an alternative employment for these people. There are lots of people in the Amazon, it's 20 million people. I don't know if the Amazon can carry 20 million people, Perhaps we should, in the process, think of ways, because of biotechnology, people are very sad, oh, the forest is fully of these new products that, that we could use. And yes, I think there are some there, but not sufficient to make 20 million people sufficiently productive, sufficiently with an income sufficiently high. So we have to find, a combination of preservation, but in order to preserve, we have to pay off these people who are there and who would not find the productive employment in a way that is consistent with the preservation of the forest.
Rohini, I'm just checking in to see if you had anything to add here before we wrap up. I see that we're getting to time.
Yeah, no, I think this was a fascinating discussion. I learned a lot. So thank you to both Professor Basha and Professor Fieler, and we hope we will be able to meet on campus in the fall or sometime soon.
We hope so too. Thank you for organizing this.
Okay, in the campus and at Sally's and Pepper's.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.